Crew denies old veteran access on plane, not knowing the undercover owner was watching. Harold Winston woke before dawn. At 78 years old, his joints ached more than usual, and he had learned to greet the day by massaging his knees before ever leaving the sanctuary of his bed. He lived alone in a modest little house on the outskirts of Atlanta. Today, though, he didn't have time to lament his aches. He had a flight to catch, and if there was anything he hated, it was feeling rushed. His granddaughter, Mary, was about to have her first child in Dallas, and Harold was determined to be there. He dressed carefully in clothes he felt were most comfortable for air travel: a worn pair of slacks, a loose-fitting, button-down shirt, and his old army green jacket. Although he was a Marine Corps veteran of the Vietnam War, the jacket itself was not military-issued, but the many embroidered patches on it honored various battalions, charity runs, and veterans' reunions he had attended over the years. He wore them proudly. Outside, the rising sun colored the horizon peach and purple as he closed the trunk of his beat-up Toyota Camry, verifying again he had his overnight bag, a small carry-on, and a carefully wrapped gift for his future great-grandchild. A friend from church had gifted him a brand-new baby blanket. Harold had planned to tuck it inside his larger bag, but it hardly fit, so he left it partially sticking out of his carry-on, the soft pink corner peeking out. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was predictably busy. Harold eased his car into a remote parking lot, found a spot, and began the long walk toward the shuttle stop. Every step reminded him of the bullet wound in his left leg from decades before the pain flared with each movement, especially in cold weather. But at his age, Harold had learned to push through, to focus on the important things: family, honor, and faith. Over the years, the Marine Corps had taught him to arrive early, adapt, and stand tall in the face of adversity. So he gave himself plenty of time. Yet the hustle of modern travel, the electronic check-ins, the automated announcements sometimes confused him. The fewer obstacles, the better. When he arrived at the ticket counter, he was greeted by a neat row of self-service kiosks. Harold tried tapping the screen, squinted, then tried again, but his reservation didn't appear. He sighed. The swirl of conversation around him, people complaining about flight delays, a mother screaming for her child to wait, made it hard to concentrate. He finally decided he needed a ticket agent's help. He waited in line behind a half-dozen travelers. Directly behind him was a tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, wearing a casual navy sport coat and jeans. The man had a kind look about him, though he carried himself with a quiet confidence. Harold sensed that the man was probably well off, maybe a businessman or a frequent traveler. Eventually, it was Harold's turn. The harried ticket agent looked up, her smile obviously forced. She asked for his ID. He fumbled in his wallet before handing over his driver's license and a paper printout of his flight details. "Sir, you've checked in at the kiosk, right?" she asked, already sounding impatient. "No, ma'am. I tried, but I couldn't get it to work." She frowned at him, then rapidly typed into her computer. "Flight 794 to Dallas-Fort Worth, economy class. It seems you—" She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Did you change your reservation?" "No, ma'am," Harold responded, furrowing his brow. "I booked this flight a month ago. No changes." Again the agent typed and sighed. "Strange. The system shows something about a mismatch in your seat assignment. Let me see." Time ticked on as she made a phone call. Harold shifted from one foot to the other, resisting the urge to grumble at how every year air travel seemed to get more complicated. The man behind him in line was being extremely patient, to the point where Harold turned and gave him a polite nod. Finally, the agent put the phone down and turned back to Harold. "Looks like we oversold the flight in your fare class. You may not have a guaranteed seat, Mr. Winston." He blinked. "Ma'am, I booked a seat when I paid. I have a copy of my itinerary right here." She sighed and looked past him as if bored. "They're telling me they can't confirm your seat. You'll have to speak with the gate agent about reaccommodation. This flight is definitely over capacity." She slid his ID back, avoiding his eyes. "You can try to go through security now and see if the gate can help." Harold's heart sank. He had given himself plenty of time, but now it looked like that time might be chewed up with bureaucratic hassles. Suppressing frustration, he gathered his ID and began to walk away. Before leaving, though, he turned and asked softly, "Is there a supervisor I can talk to?" She shook her head briskly. "They'll say the same thing, sir. Please speak with the gate agent." At that moment, the tall man behind Harold stepped forward to the counter. Harold caught just a glimpse of the agent's expression. Her posture changed, her smile more genuine. Perhaps she assumed the tall man was a more important customer. Harold was too polite to dwell on the unfairness. Instead, he trudged away, determined to find the gate. The tall man paid close attention to Harold as he left, even though Harold didn't see it. The man frowned slightly, as though taking mental notes, then asked for his own ticket matters to be handled swiftly. The name on his ID, had Harold seen it, would have meant nothing to him. Robert Bob Ashford. Yet Bob Ashford was no ordinary passenger. He was in fact the founder and majority owner of Skyway Global, one of the country's largest domestic airlines. He was also there undercover, traveling incognito to inspect how his staff treated everyday passengers. Harold Winston had no idea that the unassuming man behind him possessed the power to change his entire day and possibly the direction of the airline itself. 20 minutes later, Harold stood in the security line, which was moving slower than molasses. His knee was throbbing, and a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. The crowds pressed in from all sides, each person lost in their own haste. Every 5 minutes, a TSA announcement rattled overhead. "Please remove any laptops from your bags and place them in a separate bin." After shuffling forward at a snail's pace, he reached the checkpoint. He carefully placed his shoes, jacket and carry-on in the grey bin. The baby blanket peeked out and caught the eye of the TSA agent, who nodded politely to Harold. "New grandbaby?" the agent asked. Harold's chest swelled with a little pride. "A great-grandchild, actually." "Congratulations, sir. Go on through." He mustered a smile. At least someone today had shown a bit of kindness. Once he retrieved his items, Harold hurried to the gate indicated on his paper itinerary, Gate A17. The corridor was bustling with passengers, many on laptops, some dozing, others making phone calls. A tall sign read, "Skyway Global Flight 794 to Dallas-Fort Worth on time." Relief coursed through him. At least the flight wasn't delayed. But as he approached the gate agent podium, a pit sank in his stomach. A tall woman with pinned-back hair and a stern face was scolding another passenger. "Sir, there is nothing I can do. If you can't respect the carry-on size limits, we'll have to check the bag. Move aside." Harold waited until the disgruntled passenger stormed away. Then he stepped forward. "Ma'am, excuse me." He offered his ticket. "The lady at check-in said I might have an issue with my reservation. Something about overbooking." She gave him a quick once-over, glancing at his worn jacket, the fraying edges of the patches, and the old canvas shoes he wore. She offered him a thin, superficial smile. "Boarding pass, please." He handed over his printed itinerary and ID. "I never got a boarding pass. The kiosk wouldn't give me one." She looked exasperated and typed into her computer. Several seconds passed in silence, broken only by the beep of her scanning equipment. "Right," she finally said. "We are overbooked, and you are in the lowest fare class. That means you're on the volunteer list to be bumped, if necessary." He frowned. "Volunteer list? I never volunteered." She didn't even look up. All passengers in certain fare classes are automatically considered for re-accommodation if we need seats for paying customers who are at higher classes. Harold's jaw tightened. "I paid for my ticket. I have my credit card statement." She ignored that protest, scrolled a bit more, then said curtly, "The flight is fully boarded, sir. There's no seat left in the system for you." Confusion turned to anger. "But the plane doesn't leave for half an hour, and boarding only just started." She gave him a condescending stare. "Sir, do you see the plane?" "The door is open, yes, but we've accounted for all seats. Unfortunately, you no longer have a seat. We had a last-minute passenger on a higher fare class who needed a seat." "What does that mean for me?" Her lips twisted in distaste. "It means you won't be getting on this flight unless something opens up. You'll have to wait and see if a seat is given up." Harold's heart pounded. He fought to remain calm. "I have to see my granddaughter. She's about to give birth to her first child. Isn't there some policy or courtesy for veterans or seniors?" She rolled her eyes slightly. "We don't discriminate by age or veteran status, sir. Now, if you step aside, I can board the next passenger. We're quite busy." Anger simmered in Harold's chest. He clutched the strap of his carry-on so tightly his knuckles turned white. This was exactly the sort of humiliation he had feared, treated as though he were a nuisance. Still, Harold's moral code wouldn't let him become belligerent. He forced himself to speak calmly. "Ma'am, I was told to see the gate agent. That's you, right? Could you at least put me on the standby list for any open seat?" She tapped the keyboard a few more times and thrust a slip of paper toward him. "Here's your standby pass. I doubt anything will open, but you can wait over there. If no one volunteers to give up their seat, you'll have to take a later flight, possibly tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Harold exclaimed. "I need to be in Dallas by tonight. Then perhaps you can purchase a full fare ticket if something becomes available. That's always an option." Her eyes flicked to Harold's worn clothing, as if insinuating that he couldn't afford it. "Next in line, please." Humiliated, Harold stepped away. He spotted an empty seat against the window near the gate. He gingerly sat, his leg throbbing in protest, and placed his bag on his lap. He felt close to tears, not from sadness so much as frustration. He prided himself on never losing his temper, but this was pushing his patience. Time passed, and more passengers streamed to the gate, scanning their boarding passes, vanishing down the jetway. The overhead speakers chimed with final boarding announcements. Harold kept thinking that maybe, just maybe, someone would not show up, and then the gate agent, forced to acknowledge him, would call his name. But that never happened. The minutes turned to seconds. The gate agent typed on her computer, occasionally stealing glances at Harold, who refused to budge from the seat. Finally, she called out into the waiting area. "Final call for Flight 794 to Dallas-Fort Worth. Passengers with seat assignments, please board now or risk forfeiting your seat." No one else came forward. The agent closed the door. Harold's heart sank to his stomach. He stood, limped over, and asked, "Is there a seat? Did I make it?" She shook her head, her tone unyielding. "No, sir. This flight is closed. I can see if there's another flight, but everything is full. With the busy travel season, you might get stuck here for a while." Before Harold could protest, the woman walked away. He tried to catch the eye of another airline employee behind the podium, but they wouldn't even look up. Feeling utterly defeated, Harold turned away from the gate. Unbeknownst to Harold, in a seat near the corner, hidden behind a newspaper, Bob Ashford, the undercover owner of Skyway Global, had watched the entire exchange with mounting outrage. He had boarded earlier but stepped off the plane briefly, claiming he needed to make a quick phone call. In reality, he wanted to see how the gate agent handled last-minute passenger issues. Instead, he had witnessed a callous, borderline cruel refusal to accommodate an elderly veteran who had every right to his seat. Bob Ashford clenched his fists. He had read all the memos about improving customer service, especially for veterans. He had personally approved a special courtesy policy that waived reaccommodation fees for active duty and retired military personnel if they provided proper documentation. Yet none of that had been put into practice here. Why? He needed to find out. For now, though, Bob decided to play it cool. He scanned his boarding pass, quietly re-entered the jetway, and took his seat in first class. He intended to watch the cabin crew's behavior to see if this kind of dismissive attitude extended to the staff in flight. Meanwhile, poor Harold Winston was left standing at the window, watching as the aircraft pulled away and soared into the sky without him. Harold felt a sting of déjà vu as he stood near the gate, overcome with that familiar sense of helplessness. Memories from his service days slipped into his mind as though time were folding inward. It was 1968 in Vietnam. Harold, then a young Marine, found himself with a bullet lodged in his left thigh, pinned down under heavy fire. Despite the searing pain, he had to keep moving or risk being overrun by enemy troops. Fellow Marines dragged him behind a low dirt embankment while a medic scrambled to address the wound. Harold remembered struggling to remain conscious. He also recalled the feeling of frustration and anger. Why had the platoon been left without proper support? Who had messed up the supply lines? Back in the present, the only thing that physically linked Harold to that memory was the dull ache in his leg. The frustration, though, felt oddly the same, being stranded by forces beyond his control, with no immediate help in sight. It hurt. He looked up at the closed jetway door. A wave of exhaustion rolled over him. If he were younger, he might have shouted or demanded to see a supervisor, but as an old man, he just felt defeated. People swirled around him, gate announcements for other flights crackled overhead, and no one gave him more than a passing glance. He trudged down the corridor, deciding to seek help at Skyway Global's customer service desk. He had to figure out a way to get to Dallas today. Already, his granddaughter had texted him that she was in labor. This baby could come at any time. She'd be devastated if he missed the birth. When he arrived at the customer service area, he found a snaking line of impatient travelers. Some were furious about cancelled flights, others were fighting about lost baggage. Harold got in line and stood there, leaning on his carry-on like a makeshift cane. A mother with 2 screaming toddlers was ahead of him, and the line hardly budged for 20 minutes. Finally, it was Harold's turn. A stocky man in a wrinkled Skyway Global uniform looked at him with tired eyes. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Harold explained. He'd been denied boarding on Flight 794. He was on the volunteer bump list without his knowledge, and he desperately needed to get to Dallas tonight. The man tapped at the keyboard. "Everything's overbooked, sir," he said, with the same mechanical tone the gate agent had used. "Earliest I can confirm is tomorrow afternoon around 3 p.m. If you want to go stand by for the rest of today, you can, but there's no guarantee." Harold swallowed a lump in his throat. "Is there any special consideration for veterans? I served in Vietnam. I have a veteran ID. I heard there was a policy." The man shrugged. "We do have some courtesy policies for active duty. Retirees sometimes qualify, but not in cases of overbooking. You can fill out a complaint online, sir." Heat rose to Harold's face. "This is insane," he muttered. "I bought my ticket fair and square. I'm not looking for special treatment, just the seat I paid for." The agent raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, sir. Next, please." Just like that, Harold found himself dismissed yet again. The travelers behind him in line began to shuffle forward, and Harold had to step aside to avoid being trampled by the wave of impatience. An overwhelming sense of powerlessness washed over him. There had to be something he could do. Maybe a different airline. He looked around for signage. Over on another wall, large monitors displayed flight schedules. Delta Airlines had a flight leaving for Dallas in 3 hours. Perhaps he could buy a last-minute ticket if it wasn't too expensive. But Harold's finances were tight. He lived off a modest pension and Social Security checks. The thought of paying hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars for a same-day flight ticket from Delta or any other airline made him grimace. Still, desperation drove him to check the fares on his phone. As expected, the price was staggering, nearly $100 for a one-way ticket to Dallas. That was more than Harold's monthly mortgage payment. He simply couldn't afford it. He wandered away from the chaos, searching for somewhere quiet to gather his thoughts. Eventually, he found a less crowded corridor near a row of large windows. Through the glass, he could see planes taxiing in the bright mid-morning sun. People busily loaded luggage, fueling trucks scurried around, and planes soared into the sky. All that activity, yet here he was, stuck, powerless. Harold sank into a chair by the window. His leg throbbed worse than ever. He felt he might cry from sheer frustration. But even in the face of all this, he didn't want to give in. He was a Marine, and Marines found a way. Pulling out his phone, Harold called his granddaughter Mary. she answered in a shaky voice, obviously in the throes of early labor pains. "Grandpa?" she managed between shallow breaths. "Are you on your way? Mom said your flight would land around noon." Harold squeezed the phone, trying to steady his voice. "Honey, they bumped me off the flight. I'm trying to find another option." She moaned. "But the baby, I'm dilated." Her breath caught in a wave of pain. "We really need you here, Grandpa." A pang of guilt twisted in Harold's gut. He forced cheer into his tone. "Hang tight, Mary. Babies take their time. I'll do my very best to get there before she arrives. I promise." They ended the call. Harold rubbed the corners of his eyes. He refused to let an airline's incompetence keep him from being at his granddaughter's side. He vowed to wait at the standby area for the next flight to Dallas, and if he didn't get on that, he'd try the next one, and the next. He'd camp out in that airport if he had to. And so, with renewed determination, Harold slung his carry-on over his shoulder and set out, ignoring the pain in his leg, to track down the next possible flight. Meanwhile, in the crisp skies above, Bob Ashford was en route to Dallas, seated in first class. His mind whirled in anger at what he'd witnessed, and he was already firing off clandestine text messages to his executive assistant. "Check on a passenger, old veteran named Harold Winston, was bumped from Flight 794. I want to see how staff reaccommodates him. Very important. More instructions to come." Bob Ashford leaned back in his plush first-class seat, staring at a digital device that displayed real-time flight data: altitude, ground speed, outside temperature. Flight 794 soared at 35,000 feet, carrying about 200 passengers. Many sipped drinks or watched in-flight entertainment. The flight attendants bustled around, offering warm towels and snacks to the premium cabin. Yet Bob was hardly interested in those comforts. Undercover or not, he was the owner and founder of Skyway Global, and he believed wholeheartedly in fair, respectful treatment of all passengers, especially an elderly veteran who deserved honor, not dismissal. The fiasco at the gate rattled him. The agent had brushed Harold aside like an inconvenience. Bob took note of the flight attendants in first class. They were polite, maybe even too polite, given that they had no idea who Bob truly was. But Bob wondered how they treated coach passengers. Were they as attentive? An older flight attendant approached, smiling. "Another glass of water, sir?" Bob nodded. "Yes, please. By the way, I overheard that the flight was overbooked. Did we have any standbys that didn't make it?" Her smile faltered slightly, then snapped back into place. "We had a few, I believe. That's normal these days." Bob studied her expression. "What's your personal take on overbooking? Does it cause issues for passengers, or do they accept it?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "I don't love it, but it's part of the industry. People get bumped, and there's usually another flight. Sometimes folks make a fuss, especially if they don't understand that it's in the contract of carriage. But hey, that's above my pay grade." Bob hummed thoughtfully. "Do you think we have any special policies for veterans or senior citizens who get bumped?" She shrugged. "I'm not entirely sure about the specifics, sir. We do ask for volunteers sometimes, but if no one volunteers, we go by the airline's priority list. It's not always fair, but that's how the system works." He thanked her, sipped his water, and let her move on. Inside, frustration bubbled. As CEO, he had tried pushing a corporate culture that valued going above and beyond for loyal customers, especially veterans. Yet from top to bottom, the message seemed lost. Was it a breakdown in training? A sense of apathy among the frontline employees? He scribbled a few notes on a small notepad he always carried, mindful that no detail was too small. Then he quietly pulled up text messages to see if his assistant had replied with any update on Harold Winston. A single message read, "No sign of passenger so far. I've contacted local supervisors to locate him. We'll update ASAP." Bob exhaled, impatience and worry mingling in him. He wanted to see how his staff would handle this situation. If they failed, Bob would intervene. Yet he also wanted an authentic read on their processes, not just some artificially staged hospitality once they realized they'd messed with the boss's directive. It was a delicate balance. But one thing was certain. Once he landed in Dallas, Bob intended to follow through. He might not step forward as CEO publicly, but he would definitely test the mettle of his Dallas ground staff. And he would find Harold Winston, no matter how big an airport might be. At that moment, the captain's voice crackled over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're about an hour away from Dallas-Fort Worth International. Weather conditions are good, expecting an on-time arrival." Bob half listened, staring out the window at the patchy clouds drifting below. He felt a pang of guilt. He was physically comfortable, while Harold was probably stuck in Atlanta, his dream of seeing his granddaughter's baby threatened by airline bureaucracy. If there was any justice, Bob wanted to make sure Harold's story didn't end in heartbreak. Back in Atlanta, Harold was on the brink of giving up. The next Dallas-bound Skyway Global flight was also sold out. But there was a chance for standby, so he planted himself in one of those stiff vinyl chairs at gate A29, every so often hobbling up to the gate agent to see if any seats had opened. Each time the young woman simply shook her head no, too busy to say more than a few words. And so the hours dragged on. Harold sent periodic texts to Mary, offering flimsy reassurances. In truth, he wasn't sure if he'd make it before the baby arrived. By early afternoon, he found himself exhausted and hungry. He decided to grab a quick bite from a nearby sandwich shop. The line was long, but eventually he secured a turkey sandwich and a coffee costing more than he thought reasonable, but airports always overcharged. He sat near a charging station, plugging in his phone. A few seats away, he noticed a woman quietly crying, phone pressed to her ear. She was older than Harold, with silver hair pinned back in a bun. Instinct told him to ask if she needed help, but he was so worn down by his own troubles that he hesitated. Still, after a few minutes, empathy won out. He cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, you all right? Do you need anything?" he asked gently. She looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm fine," she said shakily, dabbing her eyes. "My husband is in the hospital in Dallas. I was supposed to be on that noon flight but got bumped. Now they're telling me I can't get there until tomorrow." Harold's heart squeezed. "I'm sorry to hear that," she nodded, eyes red. "I'm just worried he won't make it through the night." Tears welled up again. A wave of compassion washed over Harold. Suddenly his own troubles felt small compared to her fear of losing a loved one. And at that moment, he realized that the airline's cold approach, its callous overbooking, was hurting people in dire, emotional circumstances. Despite his own predicament, he reached into his wallet, pulling out the few extra bills he had. "Listen, ma'am, I know how it feels to be worried about someone you love. Could this help you get on another airline? Maybe you can find a cheaper flight on Delta." She stared at the money, wide-eyed. "Oh no, I couldn't." He gently pressed it into her hand. "It's not much, but if it helps get you closer to your husband, it's worth it." Tears slid down her cheeks. "God bless you," she whispered. Harold patted her shoulder lightly. He felt a bit of relief that he could do something good with the limited resources he had. And if it meant he was stuck with no backup money for his own ticket, so be it. He would find a way. After a few minutes, she managed to pull herself together, thanked him repeatedly, and hurried off to see if Delta had a seat. Harold watched her leave, a swirl of conflicting emotions inside him. He felt grateful he could help someone, but also anxious about his own prospects. An announcement from Gate A29 jarred him. "Attention passengers on Skyway Global Flight 256 to Dallas-Fort Worth. We are oversold. We are offering a travel voucher of $300 for volunteers who will give up their seat and take a later flight." Harold mustered the energy to stand, hobbling toward the gate agent. "Ma'am, is there a chance I might get a seat if you find volunteers?" The gate agent frowned. "We're offering vouchers, but no one's volunteered yet." Also, you're number 7 on the standby list. We have only 1 seat to offer if we get a volunteer. Sorry. 7. Harold shook his head. He was that far down the list. The agent promptly turned her attention to another passenger. Harold slumped back into his seat. He watched the next flight fill up, the door close, and the plane push away. Evening approached, and it became clear that the day was nearly lost. Harold's phone buzzed his granddaughter's mother, texting updates that Mary was now in active labor. Harold responded with forced optimism. He quietly recited an old prayer from his Marine days, hoping it might give him some measure of calm. As the airport lights brightened against the dusk sky, a mixture of exhaustion and resignation crept over him. He found an empty spot near a window, took off his jacket to use as a pillow, and lay down across a row of plastic chairs. It seemed likely he would be spending the night in the airport. Meanwhile, Flight 794 had landed in Dallas hours earlier. Bob Ashford emerged into the bustling concourse at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, blending in with the crowds. He'd only brought a small carry-on, so he didn't need to wait for checked luggage. Instead, he made a beeline for a discreet hallway where one of his regional managers, Patricia Cole, waited anxiously. She recognized him instantly, though his attire was casual. Patricia extended a hand. "Mr. Ashford, good to see you. I've alerted the station manager about your visit. Is there something I should be doing now?" Bob offered a curt nod. "We need to locate a passenger named Harold Winston. He was bumped in Atlanta. I want to see how the staff handles his reaccommodation. I do not want them informed of my presence or identity. Understood?" Patricia hesitated. "Understood, sir, but the Atlanta staff said they couldn't rebook him on anything until tomorrow. Our next inbound from Atlanta arrives in about an hour, but I'm not sure if he'll be on it. I can dig deeper." Bob's eyes flashed with anger. "Find out. And if he isn't on that flight, we need to fix this now. The man's granddaughter is giving birth. This is precisely the kind of passenger we should prioritize. I want him here tonight." Patricia winced. "Of course, Mr. Ashford, right away." While Patricia scrambled to coordinate calls, Bob walked through the airport with a sense of purpose. He observed the staff at the gates, noticing whether they greeted passengers with a smile or not. He overheard a rude remark from a flight attendant to a customer complaining of a seat mix-up. Bob made a mental note to address that later. An hour passed, and Patricia returned with an update. "He's still in Atlanta, sir. My contact says he tried standby for several flights. No luck. He may end up sleeping there overnight." Bob clenched his jaw. "Unacceptable. I'm authorizing immediate use of the corporate aircraft or any means necessary to get him here. Do you understand?" Her eyes widened. "You want to send the corporate jet for a single passenger?" "If it comes to that," Bob snapped. "But first, see if we can get him on another carrier. I'll cover the cost personally if we have to." "Yes, Mr. Ashford." Patricia scurried off, phone pressed to her ear. Bob exhaled heavily, fighting the urge to slam his fist against a wall. He had always prided himself on building Skyway Global into an airline that cared. Yet the past 24 hours exposed a toxic disregard for individuals. If that was the culture now, Bob intended to uproot it, no matter how many heads would roll. Night had fallen over Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Harold dozed fitfully in his uncomfortable seat, waking every so often to announcements echoing in the empty terminal. Around midnight, a janitorial crew came through, vacuuming the carpets, their machines whirring loudly. Harold's back ached, his leg felt like it was on fire, and he was thoroughly miserable. He checked his phone, seeing updates. His granddaughter was fully dilated, the birth imminent. A pang of despair welled up inside him. He was missing it. Just as he was about to close his eyes again, a voice startled him. "Mr. Winston?" Harold blinked, seeing a woman in a crisp Skyway Global uniform. She had dark hair pulled into a bun, and she wore a badge that read, "Lauren Shield Station Supervisor." She offered a stiff smile. "Are you Harold Winston?" He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." She pressed her lips together. "We've received instructions to assist you with immediate travel to Dallas, courtesy of—" She paused, as though she might reveal too much. "Courtesy of a special directive. We have a ticket for you on a partner airline leaving in an hour. You'll arrive in Dallas by 3 a.m. local time." Harold blinked in disbelief. "What? How did that happen? I've been told all day there were no seats." She cleared her throat. "We had an internal escalation. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Now, if you'd follow me to the partner airlines counter, we'll get you checked in." Harold's heart soared with relief. He wasn't sure which angel had intervened, but he was too tired and grateful to question it. He gathered his belongings, wincing at the stiffness in his leg, and followed Lauren through the deserted corridors to the partner airline's small check-in desk. The agent behind the counter printed out a boarding pass for a flight that was indeed leaving in less than an hour. Harold stifled a laugh of pure joy when he realized he had a seat in business class, something he'd never experienced. Within the hour, Harold found himself in seat 2A on a small regional jet, heading for Dallas. Exhaustion warred with excitement as the engines roared to life. He silently thanked God for this sudden turn of fortune. Maybe, just maybe, he'd arrive before his great-grandchild was born. Meanwhile, in Dallas, Bob Ashford received a text from Patricia. "We've secured a seat for Mr. Winston on a partner airline. He'll land by 3 a.m. We'll meet him at arrival." Bob smiled for the first time that day. "Excellent," he responded. "Let me know the moment he arrives, and do not mention me or my role to him yet." The flight landed at Dallas-Fort Worth exactly at 3:07 a.m. Harold stepped off, bleary-eyed but eternally grateful to finally be in Texas. The terminal was quiet at that hour, with only a few red-eye passengers shuffling about. Waiting near the gate was Lauren Shields, the station supervisor from Atlanta, along with Patricia Cole, the regional manager. Patricia approached with a polite smile. "Mr. Winston, welcome to Dallas. We have a car ready to take you wherever you need to go." Harold was stunned. "Ma'am, I can just catch a cab or call my granddaughter. You don't have to." "It's our pleasure," Patricia insisted. "It's the least we can do after the trouble you've had." He noticed Lauren seemed less enthusiastic, almost nervous. Harold didn't know the details, but he sensed some tension in the air. Regardless, he accepted the courtesy ride. They guided him down an escalator to a private car service area. To his astonishment, a sleek black sedan was waiting. The driver opened the door, and Harold's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He wasn't used to such luxury, but desperation to reach the hospital overcame any reluctance. Before stepping into the car, he turned to Patricia. "Ma'am, I just want to say thank you. I was treated pretty badly in Atlanta. Not by you, of course, but it's been a rough day. I almost gave up." Patricia nodded, her eyes sympathetic. "I'm sorry you were treated that way, Mr. Winston. You deserve better, especially after all you've done for our country." He paused. "How did you know I'm a veteran?" She gave a small smile. "We have some of your details on file from the courtesy forms you filled out. We're hoping to rectify the situation. Please, let us take you to the hospital so you can see your granddaughter." Emotion swelled in Harold's chest. "Thank you," he managed. The car sped through the quiet streets, and within 30 minutes, Harold was stepping out at Baylor University Medical Center. He hurried to the maternity wing, leaning heavily on his cane like carry-on. Nurses directed him to Mary's room. When he arrived, it was just after 4 a.m. Mary lay in bed, a tiny swaddled infant on her chest. Tears filled Harold's eyes. He made it. He reached her bedside and gently touched the baby's cheek. "Grandpa," Mary breathed, her face glowing with relief and joy. "You're here. She was born just an hour ago." Harold could barely speak, overwhelmed by gratitude. He took the baby girl in his arms, feeling the warmth of new life. She blinked up at him, little fists curled. Harold Winston, the tough Marine, now had tears rolling down his cheeks. Outside the hospital, Patricia texted Bob Ashford. "He has arrived safely. Granddaughter just delivered baby. Winston is with family now." Bob read the message with a mix of triumph and relief. Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. in my suite at the Ritz. Bring the relevant staff from the Dallas station. Also, get me the names of the staff who denied him in Atlanta." Patricia replied with a short, "Understood." Later that morning, a tense gathering took place in a private conference room at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Dallas. Bob Ashford sat at the head of a long table. Patricia Cole stood to his right, projecting a calm authority. Across from them, seated like schoolchildren awaiting punishment, were Lauren Shields and the gate agent from Dallas, along with a few Atlanta-based employees who had flown in on an early morning flight among them, the agent who had specifically bumped Harold off his flight. Bob let a charged silence hang in the air before he spoke. When he did, his voice was quiet, laced with barely contained anger. "I have spent the last 24 hours conducting an undercover inspection of Skyway Global's customer service practices. What I witnessed was appalling. An elderly veteran was denied the seat he paid for. He was treated with disrespect and forced to sleep in an airport, almost missing the birth of his great-grandchild. He pinned the Atlanta gate agent with a cold stare. 'Your name is Miss Cameron, correct?' The woman swallowed. 'Yes, sir.' 'You were the one who told Mr. Winston there was nothing you could do. That is correct?' She nodded, cheeks burning red. 'Yes, sir. But we were overbooked, and the system—' Bob held up a hand to silence her. 'We have a policy I personally instituted. For veterans with valid ID, if we have overbooked, we offer immediate reaccommodation on the next available flight, at no extra cost, or else a free upgrade to accommodate them. Did you check any of that? Did you bother to see if we had a courtesy seat available?' Her lips trembled. 'No, sir, I wasn't aware it applied to retirees. I thought it was only for active duty.' Bob inhaled sharply. 'The memorandum I sent 3 months ago stated both active duty and retired military personnel with valid ID are eligible, particularly in overbooked scenarios. Not only did you fail to apply that policy, you showed him disrespect.' Tears glistened in the corner of her eyes. 'I'm sorry. I truly am. I didn't mean—' He turned his gaze to Lauren Shields. 'And you, Mrs. Shields, you were the station supervisor who only intervened at midnight after my office sent instructions. Why was he left in limbo for so many hours? Why did you not act sooner?' Lauren, too, looked near tears. 'I only got the notification from corporate late. I didn't realize how serious the situation was until—' Bob cut her off again. 'You should have realized the moment a passenger, a 78-year-old with a limp, was begging for help all day. I don't want excuses.' The group fell silent, heads lowered. Bob let out a long breath, reining in his fury. 'Now each of you will face disciplinary actions. Ms. Cameron, you are hereby terminated, effective immediately. Your callous disregard for an elderly veteran is indefensible. Ms. Shields, you're demoted to gate agent until further notice, pending a performance review. Anyone else involved in ignoring the policy will receive official reprimands and mandatory retraining.' A ripple of shock went through the room. Ms. Cameron burst into sobs. Lauren Shields kept her head lowered, cheeks burning with humiliation. Bob's voice carried no mercy. 'If you treat customers like trash, you have no place in my airline.' Patricia Cole stepped forward, quietly placing some documents in front of Bob. He scanned them. 'We will also be issuing a public apology to Mr. Winston and his family, along with a goodwill gesture of future travel vouchers. I plan to meet him personally.' Dismissed. One by one, the employees filed out, shaken. Once they were gone, Bob turned to Patricia. 'Arrange a meeting with Mr. Winston. I want to do this face-to-face.' Patricia nodded. 'Yes, sir. I'll reach out and see if he's free later today.' Bob's tension eased, replaced by a sense of resolve. He couldn't undo the sleepless night Harold had endured, but he could ensure that such a travesty never happened again. That same afternoon, Harold Winston stepped outside the hospital for a breather. His granddaughter's baby, little Annabelle, was healthy. Mary was doing well, though exhausted. Harold had spent the day at her bedside, marveling at the new life in his arms. A phone call interrupted his quiet moment. An unknown Dallas number. he answered hesitantly. A brisk female voice greeted him. "Mr. Winston, this is Patricia Cole from Skyway Global. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Robert Ashford, the airline's founder and owner. He'd like to meet you in person if you're willing." Harold nearly dropped his phone. "The founder? Of course, but I don't understand why." "He wants to apologize personally and talk to you about what happened," Patricia said. "He can meet you here at the hospital if that's easiest." Harold's mind spun. This was almost surreal, but after everything he had gone through, he was curious to meet the man in charge. "I'll be in the main lobby. Is that acceptable?" Patricia confirmed, and half an hour later Harold waited on a bench in the hospital lobby, uncertain what to expect. Then, from the revolving doors, the tall man who had stood behind him in line at the Atlanta ticket counter stepped in, flanked by Patricia. Harold recognized him immediately, but never would have guessed he was the airline's owner. Bob Ashford approached with a warm, humble smile. He extended his hand. "Mr. Winston, it's an honor to finally speak with you. I'm Bob Ashford." Harold took his hand, surprise rendering him momentarily speechless. "I remember you from Atlanta," he said softly. Bob nodded. "I was traveling incognito to observe our customer service. I saw how that gate agent treated you. I'm sorry I didn't intervene right then, but I needed to see what would happen without my interference." Harold's eyes widened. "So you're the reason they eventually put me on that flight?" "Yes," Bob admitted. "I pulled some strings. But I regret that you went through such trouble in the first place. That never should have happened." For a moment, Harold just stared, uncertain how to respond. Then, emotion gathering in his chest, he said, "Thank you for getting me here. I made it just in time for my great-granddaughter's birth." Bob nodded, relief on his face. "I'm glad, and I want you to know that the employees responsible for your mistreatment have been held accountable. One has been fired, others disciplined. We're also making changes to ensure this doesn't happen again. Our policy is to honor and serve veterans with respect." Harold nodded slowly, feeling a mix of vindication and compassion. He couldn't help but recall the woman from the day before, the one with the husband in the hospital. He hoped she'd also found her way to Dallas in time. Bob continued. "We'd like to offer you and your family a full refund for your ticket, plus vouchers for future flights, valid for whenever you want to visit them again. We'd also like to make a donation in your name to a veterans charity of your choice." Harold's eyes misted. That's mighty generous of you. Thank you." He cleared his throat. "But if you want to honor me, there's a homeless veterans shelter in Atlanta that's always in need. The men and women there have been through a lot." Bob smiled. "We'll do that. Whatever amount you think is suitable, we'll match and then some." A flush of gratitude spread through Harold. He extended his hand again. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford. I didn't expect all this." Bob shook his hand firmly. "It's the least we can do after the hell we put you through. I also want to say thank you for your service to our country." Harold nodded, humility creeping in. "I appreciate that. We just did our duty back then." The two men spoke a bit more, exchanging stories about airline life, war stories, and family. Finally, Bob handed Harold a small business card. "Here's my direct line. If you ever have issues again, please call me. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Harold accepted it with a wry smile. "I hope I won't have any more issues, but I thank you. And if you ever want to hear more war stories or meet folks in the veterans community, I can put you in touch. We're a family too." Bob grinned. "I'd like that." With that, they parted ways. Harold returned to the maternity ward, heart lighter than it had been in days. He peeked into Mary's room, seeing her dozing with baby Annabelle snuggled close. A sense of profound relief and joy filled him. He'd made it, and all the frustration and humiliation couldn't overshadow the precious new life he cradled hours before. Bob Ashford left the hospital, stepping into the warm Dallas sun, feeling a renewed commitment to transform his airline from the ground up. He had witnessed the worst of its bureaucracy and had taken steps to correct it. Hard karma had indeed struck those who mistreated Harold Winston, but the outcome also paved the way for positive reform, compassion, and the realignment of corporate values. In the weeks that followed, Harold Winston settled back home in Atlanta, receiving updates that baby Annabelle was thriving. Skyway Global deposited a generous sum in the account of the homeless veterans shelter Harold supported. They also sent him a first-class ticket and open-dated voucher for any travel he might need. Bob Ashford implemented mandatory staff retraining on the airline's veteran courtesy policy. He also increased oversight to reduce overbooking fiascos. In an internal company-wide memo, he cited Harold Winston's case as the prime example of why compassion and empathy must guide their actions. Mrs. Cameron, the former gate agent, struggled to find new work. Word spread that she had been fired for disrespecting an elderly veteran. Regret gnawed at her, forcing her to confront her own attitudes. Eventually, she volunteered at a local veterans organization, trying to make amends for her past insensitivity. Lauren Shields worked her new gate agent position diligently. Her pride stung, but her conscience awakened. She began treating every passenger with extra care, especially those who seemed vulnerable or confused. She vowed never again to dismiss someone in need. The woman with the husband in the hospital? She made it in time, thanks to Harold's cash and a discounted fare on Delta Airlines. She found her husband stable, and he recovered. She later wrote a letter of thanks to Harold, who graciously responded by inviting her and her husband to a local veterans charity event. In the end, kindness and justice intertwined in a story that began with heartbreak but concluded with hope. Harold Winston's ordeal showcased the worst of corporate neglect, but it also revealed the power of one resolute individual to spark change when compassion is put to action. Harold would tell the tale to his friends at the VFW Hall, always highlighting one lesson. Never underestimate who might be watching when you do someone wrong, or who might come through with a helping hand when all hope seems lost. And whenever he traveled afterward, he carried not just his tattered jacket of Marine Corps patches, but a renewed faith that sometimes the right person is there, ready to intervene, and fate has a way of taking care of those who stand for what's good and just. And just like that, justice was served, proving that standing up against prejudice and fighting for what's right can create real change. This story reminds us all of the power of resilience and the importance of accountability in every aspect of life. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and hit the subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss another story like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.